I had a question about the US fighting the British to gain independence. How can that tie into the theory that there was just a simple capital transfer from London, UK to Washington, DC? I think looking at the English speaking countries as one is not accurate. You also did mention that Nehru chose to align with the USSR instead of communism because of communism, when the US had offered India the military technological advances and so on. But because Nehru was a British appointee, he chose the USSR. How would things have looked had India chosen to align with the US? Okay, so this is something I believe I am the only person who has said this. That that after World War II, there was a transfer of the headquarters of the Anglo-Saxon Empire from London, UK, to Washington, DC. I don't think anybody else has said this. Soon, other geopolitical analysts and strategists will start saying this. That's going to happen. But thus far, I am the only person who has said this. And I understand why people don't believe that, or find or are skeptical about this claim. But that's what really happened. And we have seen these things happen, these transfers of headquarters from Rome to Constantinople. It's happened in the past. Now, it's true. The US and the British had a very antagonistic adversarial relationship for a very long time. From the US War of Independence, what was the trigger, the cause for the US War of Independence? Because the Americans of that time, of the 18th century, were British. They were British subjects. They served the British crown. They paid taxes to the British crown, to the King of England. And the question they asked themselves is, why should we keep paying taxes to a ruler who sits all the way across the Atlantic, thousands of miles away? Why should we pay taxes to him? What is he contributing to us? What is it doing for us? Why should we not keep all of this money for ourselves that we are extracting out of the resources and the territory of the US? So that's why they fought this war of independence. It was for financial reasons, for monetary reasons. It was out of greed. It was out of mutual greed. The British king, the king of England, wanted the taxes he was enjoying from the US, his colony in the US. And the settlers, the British settlers in the US, asked themselves, why should we keep paying these taxes? Why should we not keep all of this wealth for ourselves? And that was the cause of the war. Eventually, the Americans won the war. They became independent of the British, of the English. That's what happened. And even after that, there were lots of conflicts between the United States and the British and the UK, which went on until the 20th century. Yeah. And yet, eventually, the British came under the heel of the US. There is this very you may have heard of what's called the Thucydides trap. When you have an existing power with a certain sphere of influence, and a new emerging power appears and tries to claim a piece of that pie, conflict is inevitable. And this is something you see over and over and over again over thousands of periods, thousands of years of human history, of world history. Whenever an existing power feels threatened by an emerging power in the same sphere of influence, conflict is inevitable. Yeah. And yet there was no conflict ever after the American War of Independence between the US and the British, because their interests aligned for a long period of time. Of course, the British still were a major power. They still had their so-called British Empire until the World War II era. And then the Americans took over the whole thing because the British became deeply, deeply indebted to the Americans. And the Americans had the military firepower to subdue the British anytime they wanted if they stopped repaying the debt. So at the root of everything is hard power. The British Navy, they lost a significant portion of their navy in 1947. The British Indian Navy became the Indian Navy, right? It controlled the entire Indian Ocean region, from Malacca to Hormuz to Bab al-Mandeb, Singapore, all of that. They lost that. They lost eventually the control of Suez. So their empire crumbled essentially within a decade or so. And the Americans took over the reins of everything. So that is what happened. No historian says it in these words, that the British Empire continued in the form of the American Empire. But that's essentially what happened. You have to look at all the supply chains. What are empires built on? They are built on military power, on economic power. Economic power it all depends on infrastructure, supply chains, railroads, trade roads, all those things. So if you look at what happened, nothing disappeared. All the infrastructure of the British Empire remained intact. after the 1940s, but it was all taken over and built upon, enhanced by the Americans. So that's what happened. Now, when it comes to Nehru, he was an Anglophile, but he was a Fabian socialist, and that's why he was deeply uh, in awe of the kind of industrialization the USSR had achieved in a very short period of time. He wanted to replicate that in India, but in a Fabian socialist manner, which means at a very slow rate, very slow pace of improvement. 1%, 2%, 3% growth per year. That is called the Nehruvian rate of growth. That's why he aligned himself with the USSR instead of the US, despite the US offering India nuclear technology and a seat on the permanent seat on the UN Security Council. So that's what happened. Because Nehru was there, this was never possible. Had somebody else been there, hypothetically, if Subhash Bose was in power, he may have chosen to align with the US. And then that would have been a difficult dance to play, because the Americans wanted a new vassal state, a major country like India, to become part of their geopolitical grouping. So there's always the danger that when you align yourself with the interests of a bigger, larger, more powerful country, you become a satellite state. India became a satellite state of the USSR until 1991, when the USSR broke up. India was a de facto Russian satellite state. So, had India aligned with the US, India could possibly have become a US satellite state. It's possible. It's entirely possible. But what was better on balance? The kind of decay and corruption India witnessed from the 1950s to recent to until very recently, or a more rapid rate of growth, the kind of growth Japan saw, for instance. When a country in 1947, India amounted for less than 2% of the world's GDP. India had a population of 300 plus million individuals. The life expectancy in 1947 was about, I don't know, 28, 30, 32, thereabouts. That's how badly India was destroyed. For a country in that situation, it is not unreasonable to expect 10% economic growth year upon year for the next 2-3 decades. India could have grown very rapidly, the way Japan emerged from the ruins. But because of Nehru's decision, India remained in poverty and uh, destitution for a very long time, for decades and decades and decades. So things could have been different. Yeah, of course, the Americans would have wanted to extract their pound of flesh from India. But if you have the right leadership, you can dance in a certain manner with the bigger power, and it could benefit your country in a variety of ways. So that's how it is. It's all hypothetical, because it's about what if this happened or what if that happened. Well, here we are. So that's what it is.